Elena Vasquez's irrigation system failed during the worst heat wave New Mexico had seen in decades. 112 temperatures that could kill crops and people alike. When the long-haul trucker pulled over to help, she expected maybe a phone call or some water. She never expected him to reveal the one secret that would completely shatter everything she thought she knew about her family's legacy. Hi everyone. Welcome to Inspiring Journeys. Let's dive into today's incredible story. The morning sun had barely crested the Sangre de Cristo Mountains when Elena Vasquez heard the sound that every farmer dreads, the grinding metal-on-metal screech of machinery dying a violent death. She dropped her coffee mug on the farmhouse porch and ran toward the main irrigation pump house, her boots kicking up clouds of dust from the bone-dry earth. The ancient pump that had served her family's farm for 3 decades was seizing up, black smoke pouring from its housing like a funeral pyre for her hopes. Elena grabbed the emergency shutoff and killed the power, but the damage was already done. The acrid smell of burned motor windings filled the air. She knew, without even opening the housing, that this wasn't something she could fix with determination and duct tape. No, she whispered, staring at the machine that had been her lifeline. Not today. Not in this heat. The weather forecast had been brutal. 7 straight days of temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with no relief in sight. Without irrigation, her 180 acres of heirloom tomatoes, peppers, and squash would be dead within 2 days. 5 years of building her organic operation from nothing, gone. The bank note that was already 3 months behind would become a foreclosure notice. The family land that had been in the Vasquez name since 1892 would be sold to developers who'd been circling like vultures. Waiting for exactly this moment, Elena pulled her phone from her pocket, already knowing what she'd find. No signal. Cell tower that served this remote corner of Taos County had been damaged in last week's thunderstorm. The repair crews were focusing on more populated areas first. Her landline was back at the house, but even if she could reach a repair service, the nearest irrigation specialist was in Santa Fe, 2 hours away, if they'd even come out for an emergency call on a Saturday. Elena could already feel the heat building. By noon, it would be unbearable. By afternoon, it would be deadly for her crops, and potentially for her if she tried to work in these conditions. She'd seen too many farmers hospitalized for heat, exhaustion, too many who'd pushed their luck and paid the price. Elena Vasquez had inherited more than just land from her grandfather, Vicente. She'd inherited his stubborn streak, his refusal to ask for help, and his deep-seated belief that a Vasquez could handle anything the desert threw at them. But as she stood in the growing heat, watching her dreams literally drying up before her eyes, she was beginning to understand that some battles couldn't be won with pride alone. The farm stretched out around her in neat, organized rows that represented 5 years of 18-hour days. Every penny of her savings and all the agricultural knowledge her grandfather had passed down before his death. Lena had been 25. When Vicente died, leaving her a geology degree she'd never used in 180 acres of high desert, farmland that everyone said was too marginal to be profitable, they'd been partially right. The land was challenging alkaline soil that needed constant amendment, unpredictable water rights dating back to territorial days, an elevation that meant a shorter growing season than the big operations down in the Rio Grande Valley. But Elena had found her niche in heirloom, varieties that could command premium prices at farmers markets and specialty restaurants. Her Cherokee purple tomatoes, Chamayo red chiles, and Pueblo blue corn had built a reputation that stretched from Albuquerque to Denver. None of that would matter if she couldn't keep her crops alive for the next week. Elena walked the perimeter of the pump house, looking for any sign that the damage might be repairable. The motor housing was cracked, probably from the heat expansion and contraction cycles of the past few summers. The electrical connections were corroded beyond safe operation. Even if she could get parts, which was unlikely on a weekend in rural New Mexico, she didn't have the electrical expertise to rebuild a motor this size. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, "Mia, the desert gives, and the desert takes. The secret is knowing when to fight and when to adapt." Easy words when you weren't staring at financial ruin. The heat was already making her sweat through her work shirt, and it wasn't even 8 in the morning. Lena knew the statistics by heart. Heat exhaustion could set in within an hour at these temperatures, heat stroke within 2. She'd need to retreat to the air-conditioned farmhouse soon, but the thought of sitting inside while her crops died felt like surrender. She was so focused on the broken pump that she almost missed the sound of air brakes. Hissing on the state highway that bordered her property, Elena looked up to see a massive 18-wheeler pulling onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. The truck was clean and well-maintained, with Hayes Transport, Denver to El Paso painted on the cab door in faded blue letters. A man climbed down from the driver's seat, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent decades climbing in and out of truck cabs. He was probably in his early 60s, with silver-gray hair under a Colorado Rockies baseball cap and the kind of deep tan that came from years of driving with the window down. His work clothes were clean but worn, and he had the solid build of someone who'd done physical work his whole life. "Morning, miss," he called out, staying on the far side of the fence that separated her property from the highway. Saw that smoke from about a mile off. "Everything okay over there?" Elena's first instinct was to say yes, that everything was fine, that she could handle whatever problem she was having. It was the same instinct that had kept her from calling her uncle in Espanola when the bank first started sending threatening letters. The same pride that had prevented her from accepting her college. Roommates offered to co-sign a loan when the farm equipment dealer demanded cash up front. But standing in the growing heat, with the smell of burned motor oil in her nostrils and the sound of her crops slowly dying around her, Elena found herself hesitating. "Irrigation pump died," she found herself saying. "Picked a hell of a day." For it, the trucker nodded sympathetically. "Mind if I come take a look? I'm not an expert, but I've seen my share of broken machinery over the years." "Name's David Hayes, by the way. Most folks call me Cisco." Lena studied him for a moment. Had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed sunglasses. Something about his posture suggested a man who was comfortable giving help, but wouldn't push where he wasn't wanted. Still accepting assistance from a complete stranger went against everything her grandfather had taught her about self-reliance. "Appreciate the offer, but I can handle this," Elena said, though even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Cisco nodded toward the pump house, where wisps of smoke were still rising from the motor housing. "That's a big operation to lose to mechanical failure. Been driving this route for 15 years and I've never seen heat like this." The radio's been full of warnings about heat-related emergencies all morning. Something in his tone made Elena look at him more carefully. This wasn't the casual concern of a passerby. There was real understanding in his voice, like someone who'd seen the consequences of pride meeting impossible circumstances. "You seem to know a lot about farming for a trucker," Elena observed. Cisco smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've picked things up over the years. My route takes me through a lot of agricultural areas. Seen plenty of operations struggle with equipment failures and weather emergencies."
Ow.
Sometimes the difference between saving a crop and losing everything is just having an extra pair of hands at the right moment. The sun was climbing higher, and Elena could feel sweat beginning to bead on her forehead despite the early hour. The temperature gauge on her phone read 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was only 8:30 in the morning. By noon, the heat would be life-threatening. For anyone working outside without proper precautions. "Look," Cisco continued, "I'm not trying to interfere with your business. But I've got some tools in my truck and I know enough about motors to at least tell you if that pump is salvageable. If nothing else, I can give you a ride into town to call for professional help." This kind of heat isn't something to mess around with. Elena found herself wavering. The nearest town was Truchas, population 894. And even if they had a repair service, which they didn't, it would be closed on Saturday. The next closest option was Espanola, 30 miles of winding mountain. Roads that would take an hour to drive in her aging pickup truck? And that was assuming she could even reach someone willing to make an emergency call to a small farm in the middle of nowhere. "I don't even know you," Elena said, but she could hear her resolve weakening. "Fair enough," Cisco replied.
Tell
"You what you can call the state police, give them my license plate number, they'll confirm I'm legitimate. I'll wait right here by my truck while you make the call." The offer was reasonable, but Elena realized she couldn't make any calls without driving back to the farmhouse for the landline. And that would mean wasting precious time when every minute mattered for her crops. "Why are you stopping?" she asked. Suddenly, I mean, you've got a schedule to keep, right? Deliveries to make? Cisco was quiet for a moment, looking out across her farm with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Sometimes schedules aren't the most important thing, he said finally. Sometimes you see someone in trouble and you remember what it's like when the whole world seems to be working against you. There was something in his voice, a weight that suggested personal experience with impossible situations. Elena found herself studying his face, noticing the careful way he held himself. Like someone who'd learned to be patient with other people's crises because he understood what crises felt like. You've been in situations like this before, Elena. Said it wasn't a question. Different circumstances, same feeling, Cisco confirmed. That moment when you realize you're fighting something bigger than you can handle alone. But asking for help feels like admitting defeat. Elena felt a shock of recognition. That was exactly how she felt, not just about the broken pump, but about the entire struggle to keep her family's farm alive. Every day felt like a battle against forces beyond her control: weather, markets, regulations, competition from industrial operations that could absorb losses she couldn't afford. The heat was becoming more oppressive by the minute. Elena could see her crops already beginning to wilt in the direct sunlight, their leaves starting to curl inward to conserve moisture. Without irrigation, the careful balance she'd maintained for 5 years would collapse within days. "What kind of tools do you have?" she heard herself asking. Cisco brightened slightly. "Full mechanics kit, I do my own truck maintenance on the road. Multimeter for electrical diagnosis, basic hand tools, some spare parts that might work as temporary fixes. I'm not saying I can rebuild your motor, but I might be able to jury-rig something to get you through this heat wave." The pragmatic part of Elena's mind recognized that this was probably her best option. The nearest irrigation specialist wouldn't be available until Monday at the earliest. Even then, parts for a 30-year-old pump would need to be special ordered. A temporary fix that could keep water flowing for a few days might be the difference between saving her crop and losing everything. But accepting help from a stranger felt like crossing a line she'd never crossed before. Elena had built her operation on the principle of self-reliance, of proving that a single woman could make a go of farming without depending on anyone else. Her grandfather had always said that the Vasquez family took care of their own problems. Vicente never had to deal with climate change and corporate agriculture, Elena muttered to herself. "Excuse me?" Cisco asked. "Nothing. Just talking to myself." Elena wiped sweat from her forehead and made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. "Okay, you can take a look. But I'm not making any promises about accepting help." "Oh, blah da 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 da," Cisco nodded seriously. "Understood. Let me get my tools." He walked back to his truck with the measured pace of someone who'd learned not to waste energy in the heat. Elena watched him open a massive toolbox mounted behind the cab, pulling out a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of quality tools. Everything about his movements suggested competence and experience. As Cisco approached the gate that separated her property from the highway, Elena realized she was about to let a complete stranger onto her land, something she'd never done before. But watching him organize his tools with professional efficiency, she found herself feeling more hopeful than she had since the pump failed. "Gates unlocked," she called out, then immediately wondered if that had been smart. But Cisco just nodded and let himself through, careful to latch it behind him. "Safety first," he said, noticing her expression. "Never know when livestock might decide to wander." "I don't have livestock," Elena said. "Good habit anyway." Cisco approached the pump house with the cautious respect of someone who'd learned that mechanical failures could be dangerous. "Mind if I take a look at what we're dealing with?" Elena gestured toward the smoking motor housing. "Be my guest. But I'm warning you, it's probably beyond salvage." Cisco set down his tool bag and walked around the pump assembly, examining it from multiple angles without touching anything. His inspection was methodical and professional, like someone who'd diagnosed mechanical problems many times before. "Tell me what happened," he said, pulling out a small flashlight to peer into the motor housing. "I heard grinding, then smoke," Elena explained. "Hit the emergency cutoff as fast as I could, but the damage was already done." Cisco nodded, using his flashlight to examine the electrical connections. "How old is this unit?" "About 30 years. It was installed when my grandfather upgraded from flood irrigation to drip systems. Good bones, Cisco observed. These old motors were built to last. Mind if I check the electrical systems? I'll need to turn the power back on for just a moment. To run some diagnostics. Elena hesitated. Is that safe? I'll be careful. Just need to see what kind of readings I get on the electrical side. Cisco pulled a professional-looking multimeter from his bag. This'll tell us if we're dealing with mechanical failure, electrical, problems, or both. Watching him work, Elena found herself reassessing her initial assumptions. This wasn't some random trucker who decided to play mechanic. Cisco clearly knew what he was doing. His diagnostic approach was systematic and knowledgeable, and his tools were the kind that came with experience rather than good intentions. You really do know about machinery, Elena observed. Picked it up over the years, Cisco said, but there was something evasive in his tone that made Elena think there was more to the story. The heat was becoming brutal. Even in the shade of the pump house, Elena could feel sweat soaking through her shirt. The temperature had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was still hours away from its peak intensity. We should probably work fast, Elena said. This heat is getting dangerous. Cisco looked up from his multimeter readings. You're right. Tell you what, let me do a quick diagnostic and then we'll retreat to somewhere with air conditioning. To talk about options? Sound good? Elena nodded, grateful that he understood the urgency. She watched as Cisco methodically tested various components, his movements efficient and purposeful. Whatever his background, he clearly wasn't wasting time or effort. After 10 minutes of testing, Cisco powered down the system and packed up his multimeter. Good news and bad news, he announced. The motor's shot completely seized. But the electrical systems are intact and the pump housing is undamaged. If we can find a replacement motor with compatible mounting, you might be back in business. Where am I going to find a replacement motor on a Saturday in rural New Mexico? Elena asked. Cisco smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. That's where my route schedule might actually help. I'm headed south to Las Cruces with a delivery, then swinging back north through Albuquerque tomorrow. Industrial supply houses, agricultural equipment dealers, places that might have what you need. Elena stared at him. You'd be willing to help me track down parts? Like I said, sometimes schedules aren't the most important thing. Cisco picked up his tool bag. But right now we need to get out of this heat before we both end up as heat stroke statistics. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Elena found herself speechless. She'd been prepared for sympathy, maybe some basic mechanical advice. She hadn't expected someone to volunteer to reorganize their entire weekend to help a stranger save her farm. I don't understand, Elena said finally. Why would you do that for someone you just met? Cisco was quiet for The offer was reasonable, but Elena realized she couldn't make any calls without driving back to the farmhouse for the landline. And that would mean wasting precious time when every minute mattered for her crops. Why are you stopping? She asked. Suddenly, you've got a schedule to keep, right? Deliveries to make? Cisco was quiet for a moment, looking out across her farm with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Sometimes schedules aren't the most important thing, he said finally. Sometimes you see someone in trouble and you remember what it's like when the whole world seems to be working against you. There was something in his voice, a weight that suggested personal experience with impossible situations. Elena found herself studying his face, noticing the careful way he held himself. Like someone who'd learned to be patient with other people's crises because he understood what crises felt like. You've been in situations like this before, Elena. Said it wasn't a question. Different circumstances, same feeling, Cisco confirmed. That moment when you realize you're fighting something bigger than you can handle alone. But asking for help feels like admitting defeat. Elena felt a shock of recognition. That was exactly how she felt, not just about the broken pump, but about the entire struggle. The farmhouse has air conditioning, Elena heard herself saying. We could discuss your idea about finding parts while we cool off. Cisco smiled gratefully. That sounds like a plan. This heat isn't sustainable for much longer. As they walked toward the farmhouse, Elena noticed how Cisco took in details of her operation, the neat rows of crops, drip irrigation lines, the solar panels that powered her water pumps. His observations weren't casual. They were the assessments of someone who understood agriculture. Heirloom varieties?" he asked, gesturing toward a section of purple-leafed plants. "Cherokee purple tomatoes," Elena confirmed, surprised by his knowledge. "And Chimayo red chiles over there. How did you know?" "The leaf structure and spacing? You don't see plantings like this on commercial operations?" Cisco paused near a row of distinctive blue-kerneled corn. "Pueblo blue corn?" Elena stopped walking. "Okay, you definitely know more about farming than you're letting on. Most truckers wouldn't recognize heritage varieties, especially southwestern ones." Cisco was quiet for a moment, and Elena saw something flicker across his face. Pain, maybe. Or regret, like I said. You pick things up over the years. But Elena sensed there was more to it than that. The way Cisco moved through her farm, the knowledge he displayed, the careful respect he showed for her crops. These weren't the casual observations of someone who'd learned about agriculture from highway conversations. They reached the farmhouse. Porch, a covered area that provided blessed relief from the direct sunlight. Elena's grandfather had built the house in 1963. And while she'd modernized the interior, the exterior still retained its original adobe construction and traditional vigas. The thick walls and deep-set windows were designed for desert living, keeping the interior cool, even in extreme heat. "Beautiful place," Cisco observed, admiring the traditional architecture. "Your grandfather's work? You seem to know a lot." "About my family history, too," Elena said, unlocking the front door. "Small communities talk. Stopped for coffee in Truch's this morning, and the waitress mentioned the Vasquez farm. Said your grandfather was legendary in these parts." Elena felt a familiar mix of pride and pressure at the mention of Vicente's reputation. Her grandfather had been a respected figure in the valley. He's known for his innovative water management techniques and his willingness to help other farmers during difficult times. Living up to his legacy felt impossible some days. The interior of the farmhouse was mercifully cool, the ancient swamp cooler working overtime but managing to keep the temperature bearable. Elena gestured toward the kitchen table, a massive piece of hand-carved pine that had been in the family for generations. "Coffee? Water?" "Something stronger," she offered. "Water would be great. Need to stay hydrated in this heat." Elena pulled 2 bottles from the refrigerator and joined Cisco at the table. In the better light of the kitchen, she could see him more clearly. He was probably in his early 60s, with the kind of tan that came from years of outdoor work, rather than recreational sun exposure. His hands were calloused but clean, and he wore a simple wedding ring that looked like it had been there for decades. "8. So," Elena said, settling into her chair, "tell me about this plan to find replacement parts." Cisco pulled out a small notebook and flipped to a clean page. "I've got delivery scheduled in Las Cruces and Roswell over the next 2 days. Both towns have agricultural supply houses, and Las Cruces has a university extension program that might have connections to equipment dealers. If we can get specifications for your motor, I can make some calls." Elena watched him write notes in precise handwriting, struck again by how organized and professional his approach was. This is really above and beyond what anyone would expect. "From a good Samaritan?" maybe Cisco said. But I've got the time and the route, and you've got the need. Sometimes things line up in ways that make helping each other the obvious choice." There was something in his tone that suggested this philosophy came from personal experience. Elena found herself curious about what had shaped Cisco's worldview. What had made him the kind of person who would reorganize his weekend to help a stranger save her farm? "Can I ask what you meant earlier? About understanding what it's like to lose something you've poured your life into?" Cisco was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at Elena's struggling crops. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I used to farm. Different climate, different crops, but the same challenges. Equipment failures, weather disasters, market fluctuations that could wipe out a year's work in a single season." "What happened?" Elena asked gently. "Drought. 4 years in a row. Used up all my savings trying to keep the operation alive. Borrowed against everything I owned. Finally had to sell to a development company just to pay off the debt." The voice was matter-of-fact, but Elena could hear the pain underneath. "That was 12 years ago. It's been driving truck ever since." Elena felt a chill despite the air conditioning. This was exactly the scenario that haunted her nightmares. the slow erosion of resources. The mounting debt, the eventual surrender to forces beyond her control. Cisco wasn't just offering help. He was offering the perspective of someone who'd walked the path she was trying to avoid. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been devastating. But it also taught me something important about accepting help when it's offered. I was too proud to ask for assistance when I needed it most. I thought I could handle everything myself." Cisco looked directly at Elena. "Sound familiar, Elena?" Felt heat rise in her cheeks. Maybe a little. "The thing is, I probably could have saved the farm if I'd been willing to reach out earlier. Instead, I waited until it was too late, until pride had cost me everything I cared about." The parallel to her own situation was unmistakable. Elena had been struggling alone for months, refusing help from family members, declining offers of assistance from neighboring farmers, determined to prove she could make it on her own. But listening to Cisco's story, she began to wonder if her independence was actually a form of self-sabotage. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked. "Because I see something in you that reminds me of myself at that age. The same determination, the same pride, the same unwillingness to admit when the problems are bigger than one person can handle alone." Cisco leaned forward slightly. "And because maybe helping you succeed is a way of making peace with my own failures." The honesty in his voice was startling. Lena had expected sympathy, maybe some mechanical expertise. She hadn't expected this level of personal revelation from a stranger. "You don't even know me," Elena pointed out. "I know enough. I know you're fighting to keep a family legacy alive. I know you're working land that's been in your family for generations. I know you're facing the same impossible choices I faced, and I know how that feels." Cisco paused. "And I know that sometimes the difference between success and failure is just having someone willing to help when it matters most." Lena stared at him, processing the implications of what he was offering. This wasn't just mechanical assistance or parts procurement. This was partnership from someone who understood her situation from the inside. "What would you want in return?" she asked, her practical mind asserting itself. Cisco smiled, and for the first time since they'd met, it seemed completely genuine. "The satisfaction of knowing that someone didn't have to go through what I went through. That's enough." Elena found herself believing him, which was perhaps the most surprising development of an already surreal morning. Everything about Cisco suggested sincerity, his body language, his tone of voice, the specific details of his own story. This wasn't someone with hidden motives. This was someone offering help because he understood what desperation felt like. "Okay," Elena said, the word coming out before she'd fully decided to speak it. "Okay, let's try to find a replacement motor." Cisco's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Great. First thing we need is the exact specifications from your current motor. Model number, voltage requirements, mounting configuration, everything a supplier would need to find a compatible replacement." Lena felt a surge of hope that she hadn't experienced in months. "The manual is in my grandfather's files. He kept documentation on everything. Perfect. While you're looking for that, I'll make some preliminary calls to see what's available in Las Cruces and Roswell. If we're lucky, someone will have something in stock." As Elena headed toward Vicente's old office to search for the pump documentation, she found herself marveling at how quickly her day had changed. This morning, she'd been facing catastrophic equipment failure alone. Now, she had a partner with both the knowledge and the connections to potentially solve her problem. But as she pulled files from her grandfather's meticulously organized cabinet, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Cisco's story than he'd revealed. His knowledge of agriculture was too specific, his understanding of her situation too precise for someone whose farming experience had ended 12 years ago. She found the motor specifications and returned to the kitchen to find Cisco already on his phone, speaking in rapid Spanish to someone who was apparently quite happy to hear from him. Sir, entiendo. ¿Tienes algo compatible en stock? Cisco was saying, perfecto, reservémoslo, por favor, estaría mañana, por la tarde. Elena waited for him to finish the call, impressed by his fluency. When he hung up, he was grinning. Good news. Agricultural supply of Las Cruces has a refurbished motor that should work. Compatible voltage and mounting. Slightly higher horsepower, which is actually better for your application. They'll hold it until tomorrow afternoon. Elena felt a rush of relief so strong it was almost overwhelming. You found one? Already? Sometimes it pays to have relationships with suppliers. I've been driving the agricultural circuit for 12 years. You get to know people. Cisco's expression grew more serious. But we'll need to verify compatibility with your pump housing and electrical systems before we commit to the purchase. How much? Elena asked, dreading the answer. $1,500? That includes installation if we can get it there? Elena felt her heart sink. $1,500 might as well have been $15,000 given her current financial situation. The farm was already operating on borrowed time, the creditors becoming increasingly impatient, and her savings account depleted months ago. I see, she said quietly. Cisco must have read the disappointment in her expression. What's the problem? Elena hesitated, reluctant to reveal the depth of her financial difficulties to someone she'd just met. But Cisco had been honest about his own struggles, and something about his straightforward manner encouraged reciprocal honesty. I don't have $1,500, she admitted. I barely have $1,500 left in the world. Cisco was quiet for a moment, and Elena braced herself for the awkward withdrawal of his offer to help. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. What about payment terms? Many agricultural suppliers understand cash flow challenges. Elena shook her head. I'm already behind on payments to 3 different equipment dealers. Nobody's going to extend credit to someone who's not current on existing accounts. What about family? Friends who might be willing to help? My uncle in Espanola has offered, but he's got his own problems. Besides, I've been trying to prove I can do this on my own. Elena felt tears threatening and blinked them back angrily. Stupid pride, right? Just like you said. Cisco studied her for a long moment, and Elena could see him working through something in his mind. Finally, he pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn business card. I've got a proposition for you, he said, but it might sound a little crazy. Elena looked at the card. Hayes Agricultural Consulting, Sustainable Farming Solutions. Below the text was contact information for David C. Hayes, with addresses in Colorado and New Mexico. You're an agricultural consultant? Elena asked, confused, among other things. I started the consulting business a few years after I lost my farm. Turns out that failing at farming teaches you a lot about what works and what doesn't. Cisco smiled ruefully. I help other farmers avoid the mistakes I made. Elena stared at the card, pieces clicking into place. That's how you knew about my crops, about heritage varieties and water management. Partly. But there's more to it than that. Cisco took a deep breath. Lena, I didn't stop at your farm by accident this morning. I've been driving past this place for 3 years, watching your operation, impressed by what you're accomplishing here. Lena felt a chill despite the air conditioning. What do you mean you've been watching? Not stalking, Cisco said quickly. Professional interest. Your grandfather Vicente was legendary in agricultural circles throughout the Southwest. When word got out that his granddaughter was continuing his work with heirloom varieties and sustainable practices, people in my business took notice. Elena's mind was reeling. People in your business? Agricultural consultants? Extension? Agents? Sustainable farming advocates? Your operation here has become something of a model for small-scale heritage agriculture in high-desert environments. Cisco leaned forward. Lena, you're doing something important here, something that goes beyond just making a living. I'm just trying to keep my grandfather's farm alive, Elena protested. You're preserving genetic diversity in crop varieties that have been grown in this region for centuries. You're demonstrating that small-scale agriculture can be both economically viable and environmentally sustainable. You're carrying on traditions that would otherwise be lost to industrial farming. Cisco's voice carried genuine conviction. That's worth preserving. Elena felt overwhelmed by this sudden shift in perspective. She'd been thinking of herself as a struggling farmer, barely keeping her head above water. The idea that her work had broader significance was both thrilling and terrifying. What are you proposing? She asked. Partnership. I'll front the money for the motor replacement and any other equipment needs that come up. In exchange, you let me document your operation for a case study on sustainable heritage farming. If it works out, we could potentially access grants and funding for agricultural preservation that could secure your long-term viability. Elena stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You'd invest in my farm? I'd invest in what you're doing here. Farming practices, the heritage preservation, the proof that small-scale agriculture can work in challenging environments. Cisco's expression was completely serious. Elena, you're sitting on something valuable that goes way beyond just growing crops. You just need help recognizing it. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Elena found herself speechless. This morning, she'd been facing the loss of everything. She was being offered not just salvation, but validation that her work mattered beyond her own survival. But accepting Cisco's help would mean admitting that she couldn't make it alone, that her grandfather's legacy required more than just her own determination to survive. As Elena sat in the cool kitchen, listening to the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of her crops slowly dying in the heat, she realized that the choice wasn't really about pride anymore. It was about whether she was willing to trust a stranger who seemed to understand her situation better than she understood it herself, and, more importantly, whether she was brave enough to believe that her small farm in the middle of nowhere might actually be worth saving. Elena stared at Cisco's business card, her mind struggling to process the complete reversal of her understanding of the situation. This morning, she'd thought she was accepting help from a kind stranger. Now she was discovering that he was a professional who'd been aware of her operation for years. "You've been watching my farm for 3 years?" she asked, needing clarification. "Not watching in a creepy way," Cisco said quickly. "But yes, I've been aware of your work here. Your grandfather Vicente was something of a legend in sustainable agriculture circles. When word spread that you were continuing his legacy with heritage varieties, people took notice." Elena felt a strange mix of pride and unease.
What kind
of people? Cisco pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be a contacts list. Agricultural extension agents, university researchers, sustainable farming advocates, heritage seed preservation organizations. Your operation here represents something that's becoming increasingly rare. Successful small-scale farm using traditional methods to grow varieties that are disappearing from commercial agriculture. I had no idea anyone outside this valley knew what I was doing, Elena said, genuinely surprised. That's part of what makes it so valuable. You're not farming for recognition or grants or academic study. You're farming because it's your family's land. You're committed to keeping it productive, using methods your grandfather taught you. Cisco leaned back in his chair. That kind of authentic commitment is rare in agriculture today, Elena studied. His face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. But Cisco's expression was open and sincere, and his knowledge of agricultural issues seemed detailed to be fabricated. "So when you stopped this morning, it wasn't really a coincidence," she said. "The timing was coincidental. I wasn't planning to stop today. But when I saw smoke coming from your pump house, I knew this farm couldn't afford to lose its irrigation system." Cisco paused. "I've seen too many small operations go under because of equipment failures. Sometimes a little help at the right moment makes all the difference." Elena appreciated his honesty, but she was still processing the implications. "You said people in your business have been watching my operation. What does that mean exactly?" Cisco set down his water bottle and adopted a more formal tone. "Elena, you're preserving crop varieties that have been grown in this region for centuries. We're Chimayo chiles, Pueblo blue corn, Cherokee purple tomatoes. These aren't just crops. They're genetic heritage. Every year that industrial agriculture focuses on hybrid varieties optimized for yield and shipping, we lose more of the genetic diversity that sustained human civilization for thousands of years." The passion in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just professional interest. Cisco genuinely cared about the broader implications of her work. "But I'm just growing food to sell at farmers' markets," Elena protested. "I'm not some heritage preservation expert. It's exactly why it matters. You're not growing these varieties as a museum piece or academic exercise. You're proving they can be economically viable in modern agricultural markets." Cisco pulled out his notebook and flipped to a page covered with detailed notes. Yield per acre on heritage tomatoes is comparable to commercial operations. but your price point is 30% higher because of quality and market demand. Your chili production maintains genetic characteristics that have been lost in commercial varieties while still meeting modern food safety standards. Elena stared at him. How do you know my yield numbers? Public records from the farmers? Markets where you sell, combined with observable field data? It's not classified information, but it takes someone with agricultural background to interpret the significance. Cisco looked slightly embarrassed. I may have done some research. Elena felt a laugh bubbling up despite her confusion. You've been conducting agricultural surveillance on my farm. When you put it that way, it sounds more sinister than it was intended. Cisco smiled ruefully. But yes, I've been documenting your operation as a case study in successful heritage farming. Elena shook her head, still trying to wrap her mind around this revelation. So your offer to help with the motor replacement, is that part of your research? No, Cisco said firmly. That's personal. I saw someone in trouble, someone doing work I believe in, and I wanted to help. The business proposal is separate from the emergency assistance. Something in his tone convinced Elena that he was being truthful. The distinction between personal help and professional interest seemed important to him. Okay, Elena said slowly. Tell me about this partnership idea. What exactly are you proposing? Cisco opened his notebook to a fresh page and began sketching what looked like an organizational chart. The basic concept is documentation and promotion of your sustainable farming methods. I would work with you to create detailed case studies of your growing techniques, yield data, financial models, and market strategies. Then we'd use that documentation to access funding sources specifically designed to support heritage agriculture preservation. What kind of funding sources? USDA grants for sustainable agriculture research, state programs for heritage crop preservation, foundation grants for rural economic development, university partnerships for agricultural education. Cisco's pen moved quickly as he listed possibilities. There's more money available for this kind of work than most small farmers realize, but accessing it requires documentation and professional presentation that's hard to do while you're busy actually farming. Elena felt a spark of hope. And you think my operation would qualify for these programs? I think your operation is exactly what these programs are designed to support. Small-scale, heritage-focused, economically viable, environmentally sustainable, culturally significant. Cisco looked up from his notes. The challenge is usually finding farms that meet all those criteria, are willing to participate in documentation and promotion efforts. The idea was intriguing, but Elena had learned to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. What would be required from me? Access to your farming records, cooperation with documentation efforts, willingness to host occasional visitors who want to learn about your methods, participation in case study development. Cisco paused. An openness to implementing some improvements that might increase efficiency or yield without compromising the heritage aspects of your operation. What kind of improvements? Better irrigation efficiency, soil amendment techniques, integrated pest management using traditional methods, market development strategies. Cisco gestured toward the window, where Elena's struggling crops were visible. For example, a backup irrigation system might have prevented today's crisis. Without requiring any changes to your growing methods, Elena had to admit the logic was sound. Her commitment to traditional farming didn't have to mean accepting unnecessary risks or inefficiencies. How would the financial arrangement work? She asked. I would cover immediate equipment needs and operational expenses in exchange for documentation rights and a percentage of any grant funding we secure together. Cisco pulled out a calculator and began working through numbers. Based on preliminary research, I estimate we could access between $50,000 and $100,000 in grant funding over the next 2 years, assuming we can demonstrate the SDOI, viability and significance of your operation. Elena felt dizzy. $50,000 would solve every financial problem she faced and provide security for future operations. $100,000 would allow her to expand and improve the farm in ways she'd never dared to imagine. It seems like a lot of money for growing vegetables, she said. It's not just about growing vegetables. It's about preserving genetic diversity, maintaining traditional agricultural knowledge, demonstrating sustainable farming methods, supporting rural economic development, and providing education about heritage agriculture. Cisco's voice carried genuine conviction. Elena, you're doing work that has value beyond the immediate economic return from crop sales. The conversation was interrupted by Cisco's phone buzzing with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Should take this. It's my contact in Las Cruces about the motor. He answered the phone with a crisp Hayes Agricultural Consulting. Elena listened to one side of a conversation conducted in rapid Spanish, catching enough to understand that there was some complication with the motor availability. Cisco's expression grew increasingly concerned as the call progressed. Está bien, entiendo. Mantenim informado, si algo cambia, he said finally, hanging up with obvious disappointment. Problem? Elena asked. The motor I thought was available has been sold to another customer. My contact is checking with other suppliers, but it might take longer to find a replacement. Cisco ran his hand through his hair. This is exactly the kind of situation where having multiple suppliers and backup plans makes the difference. Elena felt her briefly raised hopes crashing back down. So we're back to square one. Not necessarily, but it highlights why I think the partnership approach makes sense, instead of scrambling to solve each crisis as it happens. We could develop systems that prevent crises or provide multiple solutions when problems arise. Before Elena could respond, her own phone rang. The caller ID showed her neighbor Miguel Santos, who farmed the adjacent property. Miguel, Elena answered. What's up? Elena, I heard you might be having equipment trouble. Miguel's voice carried concern. My nephew works at the agricultural supply in Santa Fe. He says they might have a pump motor that could work for your system. Elena felt a surge of hope. Really? When could we check it out? He's working today, but the store closes early on Saturday. If you could get there by 4 o'clock, he'd stay late to help you out. Elena checked the time on her phone. It was already past 11, and Santa Fe was 2 hours away. I'm not sure I can make it that quickly. What if you had transportation that could make the trip faster? Cisco asked quietly. Elena looked at him questioningly. Commercial truck can make better time than your pickup, and I know the routes. To avoid traffic, Cisco was already standing up. If we leave in the next 30 minutes, we could be there by 2 o'clock. Elena felt torn between gratitude and bewilderment. This morning she'd been a stranger to Cisco. Now he was offering to drive her to Santa Fe to check on equipment. The generosity seemed almost overwhelming. Why are you willing to do all this? She asked. Cisco was quiet for a moment, looking out at her farm with that same unreadable expression she'd noticed earlier. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested deeper emotions. Elena, I told you I lost my farm 12 years ago. What I didn't tell you is that I lost it because I was too proud to accept help when it was offered. I had neighbors who wanted to help, suppliers who would have worked with me on payment terms, extension agents who offered technical assistance. I turned them all down because I thought accepting help meant admitting failure. He turned to face her directly. By the time I realized that independence and isolation aren't the same thing, it was too late. I lost everything I'd worked for because I couldn't swallow my pride long enough to let people help me succeed. Elena felt the weight of his words. The parallel to her own situation was unmistakable. She'd been making the same choices, driven by the same pride that had cost Cisco his farm. So helping me is a form of redemption? She asked. Maybe. Or maybe it's just recognizing that farming is hard enough, without making it harder by refusing to build the relationships that could make the difference between success and failure. Cisco smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Either way, I'd rather see your operation succeed than watch you make the mistakes I made. Elena found herself moved by his honesty. The offer of help was clearly genuine, motivated by personal experience rather than professional calculation. Okay, she said, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Let's go to Santa Fe. Cisco's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Great. Do you have the specifications for your current motor? Elena gathered the documentation sheet found earlier, along with a digital camera, to photograph any potential replacement motors. As they prepared to leave, she found herself looking around the farmhouse with new eyes. If Cisco's partnership proposal worked out, this place might become more than just her family's farm. It might become a model for sustainable agriculture that could influence farming practices throughout the region. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. They walked back out into the brutal heat, which seemed to have intensified even in the short time they'd been inside. Elena's crops looked visibly more stressed than they had an hour earlier. Their leaves curled and drooping despite the early hour. "How long can they survive without water in this heat?" Cisco asked, following her gaze. "Today, maybe tomorrow if we're lucky. After that, I'll start losing plants." Lena felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. 3 days without irrigation in these temperatures would be catastrophic. "Then we'd better find that motor today," Cisco said grimly. As they approached his truck, Lena got her first close look at the massive vehicle that would be her transportation to Santa Fe. The cab was immaculately maintained, with custom chrome details and comfortable-looking leather seats. This wasn't the truck of someone barely making ends meet in the transport business. "Nice rig," Elena observed. "Thanks. I bought it when the consulting business started taking off. Turns out that agricultural consulting pays better than I expected, especially when you're willing to travel." Cisco opened the passenger door for her. The sleeper cab has a small office setup, which comes in handy for writing reports and maintaining client records on the road. Elena climbed up into the passenger seat, impressed by the truck's interior. The dashboard was equipped with GPS navigation, satellite radio, and communication equipment that looked more sophisticated than what she'd expected in a commercial vehicle. "How many clients do you have?" she asked as Cisco started the engine. "Varies by season, but usually between 15 and 20 active consulting relationships. Some are one-time projects, others are ongoing partnerships." The truck's air conditioning kicked in with a blessed rush of cool air. "Most of my work involves helping small farms implement sustainable practices or access funding for equipment upgrades." As they pulled onto the highway, Elena found herself relaxing for the first time in hours. The truck's cab was comfortable and quiet, the air conditioning was effective, and she was no longer facing her crisis alone. "Can I ask how you got into agricultural consulting?" she said. Cisco was quiet for a moment, and Elena sensed she was approaching something personal. "After I lost my farm, I was pretty bitter about the whole experience. Blamed everyone except myself. The bank, the weather, the market conditions, the government. It took a couple of years of driving truck before I started to see that my problems had been mostly self-inflicted. He adjusted his mirrors and settled into a comfortable driving rhythm. I started reading about sustainable farming methods, trying to understand what I could have done differently. Turns out there were techniques and resources I'd never heard of. Programs designed specifically to help farmers like me survive difficult periods." "So you decided to help other farmers avoid your mistakes?" "Initially, I just started talking to farmers I met on my truck routes, sharing information, connecting people with resources, that kind of thing. Word spread, and eventually people started asking me to formalize the advice." Cisco smiled. The consulting business grew out of those informal conversations. Lena was impressed by the trajectory from failure to expertise. "It must be satisfying to help other people succeed where you didn't." "It is, but it's also complicated. Every farm I help save reminds me of the one I lost. Every success story highlights my own failure." Cisco's voice carried a note of sadness. "But I guess that's what makes the work meaningful. I understand what's at stake because I've lived through the consequences of getting it wrong." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the landscape flowing past in shades of brown and green. Elena found herself studying the passing farms, noticing details she'd never paid attention to before: irrigation systems, crop choices, equipment storage, signs of financial stress or prosperity. "What do you see when you look at those operations?" Cisco asked, apparently noticing her attention. "I'm not sure. I never really thought about analyzing other farms before. Try looking with a consultant's eye." "What do you notice about their choices?" Elena studied a large commercial operation they were passing. Monoculture corn, center pivot, irrigation, large equipment storage buildings. Probably a successful operation based on the condition of the infrastructure. Good observations. What else? Elena looked more carefully. No visible workers, which suggests heavy mechanization. Uniform plant spacing and height, which probably means hybrid varieties optimized for machine harvesting. Large field sizes without windbreaks or buffer zones. Excellent. Now, what are the trade-offs they're making? Elena thought about it. High efficiency and lower labor costs, but probably higher input costs for fuel, chemicals, and equipment maintenance. Maximum yield per hour of labor, but maybe not maximum yield per acre, or maximum profit per dollar invested. Cisco nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of analysis that makes good consulting. You're seeing the business decisions behind the farming choices. Elena felt a glow of satisfaction at his approval. Is that how you evaluate my operation? Maybe. Or maybe it's just recognizing that farming is hard enough, without making it harder by refusing to build the relationships that could make the difference between success and failure. Cisco smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Either way, I'd rather see your operation succeed than watch you make the mistakes I made. Elena found herself moved by his honesty. The offer of help was clearly genuine, motivated by personal experience rather than professional calculation. Okay, she said, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Let's go to Santa Fe. Cisco's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Great. Do you have the specifications for your current motor? Elena gathered the documentation sheet. Found earlier, along with a digital camera, to photograph any potential replacement motors? As they prepared to leave, she found herself looking around the farmhouse with new eyes. If Cisco's partnership proposal worked out, this place might become more than just her family's farm. It might become a model for sustainable agriculture. That could influence farming practices throughout the region. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. They walked back out into the brutal heat, which seemed to have intensified even in the short time they'd been inside. Elena's crops looked visibly more stressed than they had an hour earlier. Their leaves curled and drooping despite the early hour. How long can they survive without water in this heat? Cisco asked, following her gaze. Today, maybe tomorrow if we're lucky. After that, I'll start losing plants. Elena felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. 3 days without irrigation in these temperatures would be catastrophic. Then we'd better find that motor today, Cisco said grimly. As they approached his truck, Elena got her first close look at the massive vehicle that would be her transportation to Santa Fe. The cab was immaculately maintained, with custom chrome details and comfortable-looking leather seats. This wasn't the truck of someone barely making ends meet in the transport business. Nice rig, Elena observed. Thanks. I bought it when the consulting business started taking off. Turns out that agricultural consulting pays better than I expected, especially when you're willing to travel. Cisco opened the passenger door for her. The sleeper cab has a small office setup, which comes in handy for writing reports and maintaining client records on the road. Elena climbed up into the passenger seat, impressed by the truck's interior. The dashboard was equipped with GPS navigation, satellite radio, and communication equipment that looked more sophisticated than what she'd expected in a commercial vehicle. How many clients do you have? She asked as Cisco started the engine. Varies by season, but usually between 15 and 20 active consulting relationships. The transformation felt both exciting and overwhelming. But as they walked toward the store entrance, Elena found herself genuinely hopeful for the first time in months. Whether or not they found a replacement motor today, she was beginning to see possibilities for her farm that extended far beyond just keeping it alive. The question was whether she was ready to trust Cisco enough to pursue those possibilities together. The Santa Fe Agricultural Supply Warehouse was a sprawling building on the industrial side of town, far from the tourist areas with their galleries and adobe architecture. Elena and Cisco pulled into a parking lot filled with pickup trucks, farm equipment, and the occasional semi-trailer making deliveries. Miguel's nephew, Carlos Santos, met them at the front door before they could even ring the bell. It was a young man in his 20s, with grease-stained work clothes and an eager smile that reminded Elena of Miguel at that age. Elena, Miguel told me you were coming. I've been thinking about your pump situation ever since he called. Carlos led them through aisles stacked with irrigation equipment, fertilizers, and farm machinery parts. The motor I found might work, but I want to show you a couple of options. Elena was grateful for Carlos's enthusiasm, but she found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of equipment surrounding them. The warehouse contained thousands of parts and components, representing solutions to agricultural problems she'd never even considered. This is impressive, Cisco observed, examining a display of precision irrigation controllers. You carry some high-end equipment here? We serve everyone from small organic operations to large commercial farms. Kinda have to stock everything to stay competitive. Carlos stopped at a section devoted to pump motors. Here's what I was thinking for Elena's situation. He gestured toward 3 different motors arranged on a workbench. Each was significantly newer and more sophisticated than Elena's failed unit, with digital displays and computerized controls that looked intimidating. The basic replacement is this one, Carlos explained, pointing to the smallest motor. Same specifications as your current unit, but with improved efficiency and reliability. $1,500, like the guy in Las Cruces quoted you. Elena examined the motor, noting its compact design and professional appearance. It certainly solved her immediate problem, but it didn't look like much of an upgrade over what she'd lost. What about the other options? Carlos's eyes lit up. This is where it gets interesting. The middle option is a variable speed motor with programmable irrigation scheduling. You can set different watering cycles for different crops, just for weather conditions. Even monitor usage remotely through a smartphone app. Elena stared at the device, which looked more like a computer than a pump motor. How much? $2,500. But here's the thing. It would probably pay for itself within 2 years through water savings and improved crop yields. There are federal tax credits for water conservation equipment that would reduce the actual cost. The third motor was even more impressive. With multiple sensors and a control panel that resembled something from a spacecraft, Elena didn't even want to ask about the price. That one's probably overkill for your operation, Carlos said, following her gaze. But it's worth knowing what's available. Precision agriculture is the future of farming, even for small operations. Cisco was examining the specification sheets for each motor with obvious interest. Elena, what do you think about the variable speed option? It's more than I planned to spend, Elena said honestly. But if it really would improve efficiency... Let me show you something, Carlos said, pulling out a tablet computer. I can run projections based on your acreage and crop types. Give you actual numbers for water savings and potential yield improvements. Elena watched as Carlos input data about her farm, impressed by his knowledge of agricultural software. Within minutes, he had generated charts showing potential water usage reductions and estimated financial returns from improved irrigation precision. Based on your heritage tomato production alone, the variable speed motor could increase yields by 15 to 20% through more precise water management. Carlos explained. Your chameo chiles would benefit even more, since they're sensitive to both underwatering and overwatering. Elena studied the projections, feeling a familiar mix of excitement and anxiety. The numbers were compelling, but they represented a level of technological sophistication she'd never attempted. How complicated is the programming? She asked. Easier than you'd think. The system comes with pre-programmed settings for most crop types, and you can adjust them based on your specific needs. Carlos pulled up a demonstration on his tablet. See? Just select crop type, growth stage, soil conditions, and weather forecast. The system calculates optimal irrigation schedules automatically. Cisco leaned over Elena's shoulder to study the display. This is exactly the kind of upgrade that agricultural development grants are designed to support. Water conservation, improved efficiency, technology adoption by small farms. Elena felt tempted by the possibilities, but the price difference was significant. An extra $1,000 might not seem like much to someone with Cisco's consulting income, but it represented months of her current financial margin. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course, Carlos said. But I should mention that we've got a promotion running through the end of the month. 20% off precision irrigation equipment, plus we can arrange financing through our agricultural lending partner. Elena looked at Cisco questioningly. What do you think? It depends on your long-term goals. If you're planning to expand or improve your operation, the investment makes sense. Yeah. If you're just trying to survive until the next crisis, the basic replacement might be smarter. The choice felt symbolic of a larger decision Elena had been avoiding. She could continue operating exactly as her grandfather had, maintaining traditional methods and accepting the limitations that came with them. Or she could embrace improvements. That honored the spirit of her grandfather's work while adapting to modern realities. Tell me about the financing, Elena heard herself saying. Carlos pulled out paperwork from behind the counter. Agricultural equipment financing through First National Bank of Santa Fe. They specialize in farm equipment loans. Understand, seasonal. Cash flow issues. flexible payment schedules that align with harvest cycles. Elena examined the loan application, noting that it required detailed financial information she wasn't sure she wanted to reveal. Her current financial situation was precarious enough without subjecting it to bank scrutiny. "What kind of credit requirements?" she asked. "Pretty reasonable for established farming operations. They're more interested in the viability of your operation than your current debt ratios." Carlos paused. Miguel mentioned the transformation felt both exciting and overwhelming. But as they walked toward the store entrance, Elena found herself genuinely hopeful for the first time in months. Whether or not they found a replacement motor today, she was beginning to see possibilities for her farm that extended far beyond just keeping it alive. The question was whether she was ready to trust Cisco enough to pursue those possibilities together. The Santa Fe Agricultural Supply Warehouse was a sprawling building on the industrial side of town, far from the tourist areas with their galleries and adobe architecture. Elena and Cisco pulled into a parking lot filled with pickup trucks, farm equipment, and the occasional semi-trailer making deliveries. Miguel's nephew, Carlos Santos, met them at the front door before they could even ring the bell. It was a young man in his 20s, with grease-stained work clothes and an eager smile that reminded Elena of Miguel at that age. "Elena, Miguel told me you were coming. I've been thinking about your pump situation ever since he called." Carlos led them through aisles stacked with irrigation equipment, fertilizers, and farm machinery parts. "The motor I found might work, but I want to show you a couple of options." Elena was grateful for Carlos's enthusiasm, but she found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of equipment surrounding them. The warehouse contained thousands of parts and components, representing solutions to agricultural problems she'd never even considered. "This is impressive," Cisco observed, examining a display of precision irrigation controllers. "You carry some high-end equipment here?" "We serve everyone from small organic operations to large commercial farms. Kinda have to stock everything to stay competitive." Carlos stopped at a section devoted to pump motors. "Here's what I was thinking for Elena's situation." He gestured toward 3 different motors arranged on a workbench. Each was significantly newer and more sophisticated than Elena's failed unit, with digital displays and computerized controls that looked intimidating. "The basic replacement is this one," Carlos explained, pointing to the smallest motor. "Same specifications as your current unit, but with improved efficiency and reliability. $1,500, like the guy in Las Cruces quoted you." Elena examined the motor, noting its compact design and professional appearance. It certainly enhanced them, actually. The grant funding allowed them to implement traditional techniques more effectively, while adding modern efficiency improvements. Cisco's enthusiasm was obvious. It's exactly the kind of project that demonstrates how heritage farming and technology can work together. Carlos was nodding enthusiastically. "Maria says it's one of the most successful small farm development projects the Extension Office has ever supported. Other farmers are asking how they can access similar programs." Elena felt a surge of possibility. That was both thrilling and overwhelming. This morning she'd been facing equipment failure and potential financial ruin. Now she was considering a partnership that could transform her operation into a regional model for sustainable agriculture. "If we moved forward with the partnership," Elena asked Cisco, "how quickly could we start the grant application process?" "I've already done preliminary research on your operation. We could have initial applications submitted within 60 days. With funding decisions typically coming within 4 to 6 months, Cisco's confidence was reassuring. "The key is demonstrating both the heritage value and the economic viability of what you're doing." Lena looked at the sophisticated irrigation equipment Carlos had shown them, imagining how it might transform her farming practices. More precise water management, better crop yields, reduced labor requirements, improved sustainability, all while maintaining the traditional methods her grandfather had taught her. "What would I need to commit to?" Elena asked. "Documentation access, cooperation with site visits, and educational programs. Willingness to share your methods with other farmers, participation in research projects that could benefit the broader agricultural community." Cisco paused. "An openness to implementing improvements that enhance rather than replace traditional practices." The requirements seemed reasonable, even appealing. Elena had always been proud of her farming methods, and the idea of sharing them with others felt like an honor rather than a burden. Carlos, she said suddenly. How long can you hold that variable speed motor? For a serious customer, a week, maybe 2? But if you're planning to finance it, we should get the paperwork started today. Elena looked at Cisco, feeling as though she was standing at a crossroads that would determine the entire future of her operation. If we move forward with the partnership, you'd cover the equipment costs as part of our initial investment? Yes. The goal is to position your operation for long-term success, not just solve immediate problems. Cisco's expression was serious. But Elena, this has to be your decision. I can offer resources and expertise, but I can't make choices about your family's land. Elena felt the weight of generations of farming tradition, the responsibility of carrying forward her grandfather's legacy while adapting to modern realities. But she also felt, for the first time in months, genuine optimism about the future of her farm. Let's do it, she said, the words coming out before she could second-guess herself. The partnership, the equipment upgrade, all of it. Cisco's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Really? Really? But I want to understand every detail of what we're agreeing to. Carlos was already pulling out documentation and forms. I'll start the equipment reservation paperwork. You two can work out the business details. As Elena watched Carlos begin the process of upgrading her irrigation system, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. This morning, she'd been struggling to survive. Now she was embarking on a partnership that could transform her small farm into something much larger and more significant. But as Cisco began explaining the details of their potential collaboration, Elena realized that her grandfather's voice was still guiding her decisions. Vicente had always said that farming required both tradition and adaptation, that successful farmers honored the past while embracing the future. The sophisticated irrigation equipment represented exactly that balance, modern technology serving traditional farming methods, efficiency improvements that enhanced rather than replaced time-tested practices. There's one more thing we should discuss, Cisco said as they waited for Carlos to complete the paperwork. The documentation process will involve some research into the history of your farming operation. Traditional methods, heritage varieties, land use patterns, that sort of thing. Elena nodded. That sounds reasonable. My grandfather kept detailed records going back decades. That's perfect. Historical documentation is crucial for heritage agriculture grants. Cisco paused, and Elena noticed a subtle change in his expression. But there might be some aspects of your farm's history that are more significant than you realize. Something in his tone made Elena look at him more carefully. What do you mean? I've done some preliminary research on land use patterns in your area. If your family's farm has some unique characteristics that go beyond just the current farming practices. Elena felt a flutter of unease. What kind of characteristics? Cisco glanced around the warehouse, as if checking to make sure Carlos was out of earshot. Elena, your farm sits on some of the most historically significant agricultural land in New Mexico. The water rights alone date back to Spanish colonial grants, and the soil composition suggests continuous cultivation for centuries before your family acquired the property. I knew the land had been farmed before my great-great-grandfather bought it, Elena said. I didn't realize it was historically significant. It's more than just historically significant. Based on geographic analysis and historical records, your farm appears to be located on what was once one of the most important agricultural sites in the entire Rio Grande Valley system. Elena felt a chill despite the warehouse's warm air. It's important. How? Cisco was quiet for a moment, studying her face as if gauging her reaction to what he was about to say. Elena, I think your family's farm might be sitting on the site of a pre-Columbian agricultural center. We're talking about farming techniques and crop varieties that predate European contact by centuries. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Pre-Columbian? You mean Native American farming? Not just any Native American farming? Based on archaeological evidence and land use patterns, your property might have been a major agricultural research and development center for indigenous peoples throughout the Southwest. Elena stared at him, trying to process the implications. Are you saying my family's farm is built on some kind of ancient agricultural site? I'm saying your family's farm might be the direct continuation of agricultural practices that have been maintained on this specific land for over 1,000 years. The warehouse suddenly felt too small, Too warm, too full of implications Elena wasn't sure she was ready to handle. How long have you known about this? Cisco's expression grew more serious. I've suspected it for about a year. That's why I've been so interested in your operation. It's not just about heritage crop preservation. You might be maintaining agricultural traditions that represent some of the oldest continuous farming practices in North America. Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her family's farm, about her grandfather's legacy, about her own role as a heritage farmer, was suddenly more complex and significant than she'd ever imagined. Does this change anything about the partnership? She asked. It makes it more important, Cisco said quietly. Elena, if I'm right about the historical significance of your land, you're not just preserving your family's farming legacy. You're preserving agricultural knowledge that could reshape our understanding of sustainable farming practices in arid environments. Carlos returned with a stack of paperwork, interrupting the conversation at exactly the moment when Elena needed time to process what she'd just learned. Good news, Carlos announced. I can hold the variable speed motor for 2 weeks, and the financing pre-approval looks positive based on your preliminary information. Elena looked at the forms, then at Cisco, then back at the sophisticated irrigation equipment that would soon be installed on land that might have supported agriculture for a millennium. The partnership she'd agreed to was already more complex than she'd imagined. But as she signed the equipment reservation forms, Elena realized that complexity didn't necessarily mean complications. It might mean opportunities she'd never dared to dream of. The question was whether she was ready to discover just how deep the history of her family's farm really went. The drive back from Santa Fe was quieter than the trip there, both Elena and Cisco lost in their own thoughts as the truck rolled through the high desert landscape. Elena stared out the window at the familiar terrain, but everything looked different now. Every farm they passed, every irrigation ditch, every ancient-looking stone wall took on new significance in light of what Cisco had revealed. You said, "You've suspected this for about a year," Elena finally broke the silence. "What made you start investigating the history of my land?" Cisco adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, clearly choosing his words carefully. It started with soil analysis. Reports from the County Agricultural Extension Office. Your farm consistently shows mineral compositions and organic matter levels that are unusual for the region. The kind of soil enrichment that typically takes centuries to develop through intensive cultivation. Elena felt a flutter of unease. You accessed my soil reports, or public records, part of the county's agricultural database? But yes, I specifically looked them up as part of my research into heritage farming operations. At her apologetically, I know that sounds invasive, but from a consulting perspective, soil quality is fundamental to understanding any farming operation. Elena supposed that made sense, though the idea of someone studying her farm's data without her knowledge still felt unsettling. What else did you find? Water usage patterns going back to the 1940s, when the county started keeping irrigation records. Your family's farm has consistently used less water per acre while maintaining higher yields than comparable operations. That kind of efficiency usually indicates farming techniques refined over many generations. The truck crested a hill, and Elena's farm came into view in the distance. From this elevation, she could see the distinctive pattern of her crop rows. The carefully planned irrigation channels, the strategic placement of windbreaks and shade structures. It looked like what it had always been to her grandfather's well-designed farm. But now she found herself wondering how much of that design was truly her grandfather's innovation. Vicente always said our family had a gift for farming, Elena said quietly. He taught me that success came from understanding the land, working with natural patterns instead of fighting them. I thought that was just his wisdom. It probably is his wisdom, but it might also be wisdom that goes back much further than your family's ownership of the land? Cisco's voice was gentle, as if he understood the complexity of what he was revealing. Elena, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier. Elena felt her stomach tighten. What? Cisco was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see him struggling with how to begin. Finally, he pulled the truck over at a scenic overlook that provided a panoramic view of the valley where Elena's farm was located. Elena, he said, turning to face her directly, my interest in your farm isn't purely professional. have a personal connection to this land that goes back further than my agricultural consulting career. Elena stared at him, feeling the ground shifting beneath her feet again. What kind of personal connection? Cisco reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. He opened it carefully and extracted what appeared to be an old photograph, faded and creased with age. "This is my great-grandmother, Isabel Hayes," he said, handing Elena the photograph. "She was born Isabel Montoya. She grew up on the land that's now your farm." Elena studied the photograph, which showed a young Native American woman in traditional dress standing in front of what looked like adobe buildings. The landscape behind her was unmistakably familiar. The same mountains, the same distinctive rock formations that bordered Elena's property. "I don't understand," Elena said slowly. "Your great-grandmother lived on my family's land, before it was your family's land, before it was anyone's land in the way we understand ownership today." Cisco's voice carried a weight of complex history. Isabel was Pueblo, from the community that maintained the agricultural terraces and irrigation systems in this valley for generations before the Spanish land grants, before the Mexican period, before the territorial acquisitions that eventually led to your great-great-grandfather purchasing the property. Elena felt as though the world was tilting. "You're saying my farm is built on former Pueblo land?" "I'm saying your farm is built on land that was never really former anything. The agricultural systems you're using, the crop varieties you're growing, the water management techniques your grandfather taught you, they're all continuations of practices that were developed and refined by indigenous farmers over centuries." Elena looked again at the photograph, then out at her farm in the distance. "How do you know all this?" Cisco took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal something he'd been carrying for a long time. "Because Isabel never really left. The land was sold to your great-great-grandfather in 1892. Isabel stayed on as what the records called a farm manager. She taught your ancestors the agricultural techniques that had been developed on this land over generations." Elena felt the pieces clicking into place with almost audible precision. "That's how my family knew how to farm this land so successfully. We had help, like more than help. Partnership. Isabel worked with your great-great-grandfather, then with his son, then with Vicente's father. She lived to be 97 years old, Elena. She was still working on your farm when your grandfather was a young man." Elena stared at Cisco, trying to process the implications of what he was telling her. "My grandfather knew her? He learned from her. The farming techniques you think of as your grandfather's wisdom, the crop..." Elena felt a flutter of unease. "You accessed my soil reports, or public records, part of the county's agricultural database?" "But yes, I specifically looked them up as part of my research into heritage farming operations." At her apologetically, "I know that sounds invasive, but from a consulting perspective, soil quality is fundamental to understanding any farming operation." Elena supposed that made sense, though the idea of someone studying her farm's data without her knowledge still felt unsettling. "What else did you find?" "Water usage patterns going back to the 1940s, when the county started keeping irrigation records. Your family's farm has consistently used less water per acre while maintaining higher yields than comparable operations. That kind of efficiency usually indicates farming techniques refined over many generations." The truck crested a hill, and Elena's farm came into view in the distance. From this elevation, she could see the distinctive pattern of her crop rows. The carefully planned irrigation channels, the strategic placement of windbreaks and shade structures. It looked like what it had always been to her grandfather's well-designed farm. But now she found herself wondering how much of that design was truly her grandfather's innovation. "Vicente always said our family had a gift for farming," Elena said quietly. "He taught me that success came from understanding the land, working with natural patterns instead of fighting them. I thought that was just his wisdom. It probably is his wisdom. But it might also be wisdom that goes back much further than your family's ownership of the land?" Cisco's voice was gentle, as if he understood the complexity of what he was revealing. "Elena, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "What?" Cisco was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see him struggling with how to begin. Finally, he pulled the truck over at a scenic overlook that provided a panoramic view of the valley where Elena's farm was located. "Elena," he said, turning to face her directly, "my interest in your farm isn't purely professional. I have a personal connection to this land that goes back further than my agricultural consulting career." Elena stared at him, feeling the ground shifting beneath her feet again. "What kind of personal connection?" Cisco reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. He opened it carefully and extracted what appeared to be an old photograph, faded and creased with age. "This is my great-grandmother, Isabel Hayes," he said, handing Elena the photograph. "She was born Isabel Montoya. She grew up on the land that's now your farm." Elena studied the photograph, which showed a young Native American woman in traditional dress standing in front of what looked like adobe buildings. The landscape behind her was unmistakably familiar. The same mountains, the same distinctive rock formations that bordered Elena's property. "I don't understand," Elena said slowly. "Your great-grandmother lived on my family's land, before it was your family's land, before it was anyone's land in the way we understand ownership today." Cisco's voice carried a weight of complex history. Isabel was Pueblo, from the community that maintained the agricultural terraces and irrigation systems in this valley for generations before the Spanish land grants, before the Mexican period, before the territorial acquisitions that eventually led to your great-great-grandfather purchasing the property. Elena felt as though the world was tilting. "You're saying my farm is built on former Pueblo land?" "I'm saying your farm is built on land that was never really former anything. The agricultural systems you're using, the crop varieties you're growing, the water management techniques your grandfather taught you, they're all continuations of practices that were developed and refined by indigenous farmers over centuries." Elena looked again at the photograph, then out at her farm in the distance. "How do you know all this?" Cisco took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal something he'd been carrying for a long time. "Because Isabel never really left. The land was sold to your great-great-grandfather in 1892. Isabel stayed on as what the records called a farm manager. She taught your ancestors the agricultural techniques that had been developed on this land over generations. They drove the final miles to Elena's farm in comfortable silence, both of them processing the significance of what had been revealed. When they pulled into the farmyard, Elena looked at her struggling crops with new eyes. These plants weren't just her livelihood. They were the continuation of agricultural traditions that had sustained people in this valley for centuries. The heat was still brutal, but Elena no longer felt alone in facing the challenges of farming in a harsh environment. She was part of a community of farmers that stretched back through generations, connected by shared knowledge and mutual commitment to maintaining productive agriculture in difficult conditions. "The first thing we need to do is get water flowing to your crops," Cisco said, climbing down from the truck cab. "Everything else can wait until we've addressed the immediate crisis." Elena nodded, grateful for his practical focus. "Carlos said he could have the motor delivered and installed tomorrow. If we confirmed the order today, then let's make that call." As they walked toward the farmhouse, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and saw it was from Miguel Santos. "Elena, heard you found a solution in Santa Fe. My nephew Carlos says you're working with Hayes Agricultural Consulting. It's excellent news. Isabel would be proud." Elena stopped walking. "Cisco, did you see this message from Miguel?" Cisco read the text over her shoulder, and Elena saw him smile. "Miguel knows the history too?" "Elena, everyone in this valley knows the history. Your family's partnership with Isabel isn't a secret. It's just not something people talk about much anymore." Cisco's expression grew thoughtful. "But it's part of why your neighbors have always been so supportive of your farming operation. They understand that you're maintaining something important." Elena felt a mixture of wonder and embarrassment. "I've been thinking I was preserving my grandfather's legacy, but really I was preserving something much larger." "We're preserving your grandfather's legacy. It just turns out that his legacy includes honoring and continuing the work of indigenous farmers who came before him." Cisco opened the farmhouse door for her. "That doesn't make it less important, Elena. It makes it more important." Inside the cool farmhouse, Elena immediately called Carlos to confirm the motor order and arrange for next-day installation. The conversation was brief and professional, but Elena found herself listening to Carlos's voice with new awareness. How many other people in her community understood the full history of what she was doing? When she hung up, Cisco was spreading papers across the kitchen table, maps, historical documents, and what appeared to be detailed agricultural records written in careful handwriting. "These are Isabel's farming journals," he explained. "My family has preserved them for over a century. I think it's time you saw what she documented about your land." Elena approached the table with reverence, understanding that she was about to see the written record of the agricultural wisdom that had shaped her entire life. The journals were filled with observations about crop varieties, planting schedules, water management techniques, and seasonal adaptation strategies, all written in both Spanish and English, with occasional notes in what Elena assumed was Pueblo language. She was a scientist, Elena breathed, reading entries that detailed experimental plantings and careful yield measurements. Indigenous farmers have always been agricultural scientists. Isabel was just working in a tradition of careful observation and systematic improvement that goes back centuries. Cisco pointed to a particular entry. "Look at this. She documented the development of the chili variety you're still growing." Lena read Isabel's notes about selecting seeds from plants that showed superior drought tolerance and flavor characteristics. The process described was exactly what Elena did every season, choosing the best plants for seed collection to maintain and improve her heritage varieties. "Doing exactly what she did," Elena said with wonder. "You're continuing what she started." That's how agricultural traditions survive, through farmers who understand that innovation and tradition aren't opposites. They're partners. Elena spent the next hour reading through Isabel's journals, discovering detailed documentation of farming techniques she'd thought were her grandfather's innovations, water conservation methods, companion planting strategies, natural pest management. Approaches all carefully documented and refined over decades of systematic observation. "Why did your family preserve these journals?" Elena asked. "Because Isabel made us promise to," she said. "The knowledge belonged to the land, not to any individual or family. She wanted it preserved so that future farmers could continue to learn from it." Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, but it was a welcome weight. She was not just maintaining her own farm, she was stewarding agricultural knowledge that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. "What's our next step?" she asked. Cisco pulled out his laptop and began opening files, documentation. "We need to create a comprehensive record of how traditional farming methods are being used successfully in contemporary agriculture. Isabel's journals will be crucial historical context, but we also need to document current practices and results." Over the next several hours, they worked together to outline a documentation project that would capture both the historical significance and contemporary relevance of Elena's farming operation. The project would include agricultural histories, scientific analysis of farming techniques, economic studies of heritage crop markets, and educational materials for other farmers interested in sustainable agriculture. This could become a model for agricultural preservation projects throughout the Southwest, Cisco said as they reviewed their plans. Demonstrating how indigenous agricultural knowledge can inform modern sustainable farming practices. Elena felt excitement building as she saw the scope of what they were planning. And it would ensure that Isabel's contributions are recognized and preserved, more than preserved, continued. The goal isn't to create a museum of historical farming practices, but to demonstrate how traditional knowledge can address contemporary agricultural challenges. As the sun began to set, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, Elena and Cisco walked out to survey her struggling crops one final time before the irrigation system would be restored. The plants looked stressed but resilient, much like Elena felt after the day's revelations. "Tomorrow, when the new motor is installed, we'll start documenting the recovery process," Cisco said. "Detailed records of how traditional water management techniques help crops recover from drought stress." Lena nodded, but she was thinking about more than agricultural documentation. "Cisco, I need to ask you something, of course. When you stopped this morning, did you know who I was? Did you know about the connection between our families?" Cisco was quiet for a moment, looking out across the farm that represented so much shared history. "I suspected you might be Vicente's granddaughter, but I didn't know for certain," until I saw your farming techniques up close. The way you talked about your grandfather's methods, the specific crops you're growing, the water management approaches you use, those all confirmed that you're continuing Isabel's work. Elena felt a complex mix of emotions. So you did have an agenda when you stopped to help. I had hope, Cisco corrected gently. Hope that the farming traditions my great-grandmother had worked so hard to preserve were still being maintained. But Elena, the help I offered was genuine, regardless of any family connections. You needed assistance, and I was in a position to provide it. Elena believed him. Everything about Cisco's actions throughout the day had suggested genuine concern. For her welfare and her farm's success, the family connection added meaning to their partnership, but it didn't diminish the authenticity of his desire to help. I'm glad you stopped, Elena said simply. So am I. They stood in comfortable silence as the desert evening settled around them. Two people, connected by agricultural traditions that had sustained farming in this challenging environment for centuries. Elena felt a profound sense of continuity, understanding now that her work was part of something much larger than her individual efforts to maintain her family's farm. The next morning, Carlos arrived promptly with the new irrigation motor and a crew of installers. Elena watched with fascination as the sophisticated equipment was connected to the irrigation system that had been designed and refined over generations of farmers. Old knowledge and new technology working together to sustain agriculture in a challenging environment. This is exactly what Isabel would have wanted, Cisco observed as they watched the installation process. Innovation in service of tradition, not replacement of it. By noon, water was flowing through Elena's irrigation lines for the first time. In 36 hours, Elena walked through her crops, watching them respond almost immediately to the return of moisture. The plants seemed to stand straighter, their leaves opening to welcome the life-giving water. They're going to be fine, Cisco said, joining her in the field. Stressed but recoverable. Traditional varieties are remarkably resilient. Elena nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Her crops would survive, her farm would continue. And now she understood that she was maintaining agricultural traditions that connected her. 2 generations of farmers who had worked this same land. Over the following weeks, Elena and Cisco worked together to implement the documentation project they had planned. Agricultural historians from the University of New Mexico came to study Isabel's journals and examine Elena's farming practices. Extension agents documented her water management techniques and heritage crop varieties. Graduate students in sustainable agriculture wrote case studies about her. The grant applications they submitted were successful beyond their most optimistic projections. Federal funding for agricultural preservation, state grants for heritage crop maintenance, foundation support for indigenous agricultural knowledge documentation within 6 months. Elena's farm had become a model for sustainable heritage agriculture throughout the Southwest, but perhaps most importantly, Elena had gained a deeper understanding of her role as a farmer. She was not just growing crops, she was maintaining agricultural traditions that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about farming in harmony with challenging environments. The partnership with Cisco evolved beyond business collaboration into genuine friendship. They discovered that their shared commitment to agricultural preservation created bonds that transcended family histories or professional arrangements. Together, they were ensuring that the wisdom of farmers like Isabel Montoya Hayes would continue to inform sustainable agriculture for generations to come. A year later, Elena stood in her flourishing fields, surrounded by visitors from around the world who had come to learn about traditional farming methods adapted for contemporary agriculture. The irrigation system that had failed in the brutal heat was now part of a sophisticated network that combined indigenous water management principles with precision agriculture technology. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Cisco, who was traveling to present their documentation project at an international conference on sustainable agriculture. Isabel's methods are being studied by farmers in 3 continents now. She would be amazed to know how far her knowledge has traveled. Elena smiled, looking out across crops that represented the continuation of agricultural traditions that had sustained farming in this valley for over 1,000 years. The crisis that had seemed so devastating just a year ago had led to discoveries that transformed her understanding of her role as a farmer and her connection to the land she sweared. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with a breakdown. That forces you to accept help from strangers. And sometimes those strangers turn out to be family in ways you never could have imagined. Elena's farm continued to thrive, but now it thrived as something larger than a family operation. It was a living demonstration that agricultural wisdom could transcend time, culture, and individual ownership to create sustainable farming practices that honored both tradition and innovation. The desert had taught her the same lesson it had taught farmers for centuries in the harshest environments. The most beautiful and productive things could bloom, but only when knowledge was shared. Traditions were honored, and farmers worked together to preserve the agricultural wisdom that made abundance possible in challenging places.